problems. So, good morning everyone, I'm Dr. Jean Fourie, and today we're going to be talking about learning problems. Now, learning problems are a key, the main focus of the work that we do as learning support educators and as remedial therapists. So for us, it's vital that you understand the nuances and the characteristics, what these things are. It's a very broad term, and we have to be able to distinguish between the various terms that fall within this space and the various difficulties that children have. So I'm going to take you through 20 slides, and this will hopefully clarify a lot of the issues around this. So I'm going to start with a broad picture of categories of disability. And when we look at disability, this is just some of the disabilities and impairments that learners can have or people can have. There's intellectual disability, people can have multiple disabilities, autism spectrum, visual impairments, auditory impairments, difficulties with speech and language, difficulties with orthopedics, physical problems, walking with feet and arms, traumatic brain injury where the brain has really been severely damaged, emotional problems, various different ones, depression and anxiety and so on, and a plethora of health impairments, cancers, and childhood epilepsy and so on. So we are going to look very carefully and in a focused way in this program at specific learning disabilities. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about today, so that you get a much better understanding of what specific learning disabilities are. So this is a disorder, and when we use the word disabilities and the word disorder, we are using those words in their, can I say, true sense, that they are severe conditions, chronic conditions, they last for a long time, they are debilitating, they make it difficult for the person to function in their workplace or their school place. So they have a severe impact on the way that the person does their everyday living. So a specific learning disability is a disorder in one or more of the basic psychological processes involved in understanding or using spoken or written language. So the underlying key here is there are psychological processing problems. And we see those psychological processing problems that are organic, so they're sitting in the brain. We see the disorder manifested as difficulties with listening carefully, thinking things through, reading, writing, spelling, and doing maths. So we as educators see the consequences, we see the manifestations of what is happening in the underlying psychological processes in the child's brain. We see that as difficulties in the classroom with listening, thinking, reading, writing, spelling, all the things that are happening in a classroom on a daily basis that children need to be able to do. So an SLD is organic. It has got to do with what is happening in the brain, in the cells in the brain, and the functioning of the neurons. So the neural connections that are happening between the different layers, the cortex and the lower brain, there are difficulties in the neural functioning of this particular learner's brain. And I just want to give you a quick little bit of biology. The cells in the brain, the neurons, are made up of a body that has got lots and lots of branches, where the chemistry happens in the brain. And what happens is an electrical signal comes along into the neuron, and where two neurons connect, there is a chemical process that takes place. So the electrical impulse is converted into a chemical chemistry, and the chemistry activates the next neuron at the receptor side, and that stimulates that neuron to form an electrical impulse going to the next neuron. So in order for the neural network to function adequately, there needs to be adequate electrical chemical stimulation of the correct sites in the brain in order to perform complex tasks such as reading, writing, doing mathematics, spelling, all the things that are required in our modern lives. So it is a true learning disability or disorder takes place at this level in the child's brain. So we're not going to go into any of that biology in more detail because we're educators, but we do need to understand the big process that takes place with learning. And this is encapsulated in what is called the information processing model. And basically it says that there is an input, some sensory input comes into the organism via all of your senses, your sense of taste and touch and smell, and sight and hearing, and our 7 senses. Input comes in. The information is processed in this amazing organ called the brain, which scientists are getting much more understanding of how it functions with all the imaging processes that they're able to do, and see exactly which parts of the brain are being stimulated at certain times with specific tasks. We process the information. And remember, our brain has 2 hemispheres, a right and a left hemisphere, so both hemispheres are involved in processing information, sometimes in different ways. And then there is an output. So we have outputs in a variety of different ways. We can move and move our eyes, play musical instruments, speak, do calculations, have relationships with people. So there's a variety of different outputs that we are able to perform with the information that we have stored and the experiences that we have stored in our particular from our experience. Okay, so this is a more detailed diagram of the input processing output model. It was first put forward by Atkinson and Shiffrin, and it is called the multi-store model of memory and learning. And this model gives us a very good framework for understanding what is happening inside the working memory of a person. So the sensory input comes into the human brain via those particular senses I spoke about. We are mostly concerned with what is happening in the visual and auditory, and haptics got to do with the tactile, all the senses that we are feeling, touch and so on. So this information is registered in your sensory memory, which then takes that information and puts it into what we consider short-term memory or working memory. It's a temporary space where the information goes, and in this temporary space, the information is we have like a space that we can do some working in. So in this space, we can rehearse the information, we can go over it, and teachers are very good at this. We make children repeat things, and we know that that is a mechanism to help the knowledge going from temporary working memory into the long-term memory. We encode the information, so it comes in as a specific signal, and then we encode it into long-term memory so that the memories of vision or auditory, our experiences, are all put into the neural network. We also in this space make decisions, and we use the space to retrieve information back which has been encoded into the long-term memory. So our long-term memory is where we keep our memories of things that happen to us, experiences, called episodic memory. It is also the space where we store semantic memories, memories of meanings, words, the understanding of the concepts that we learn at school and in the world around us all the time. It is also the space where we keep procedural memory, our memory of procedures, how we do things, how you drive a car, how you ride a bicycle, how you do something on a computer, how you write. So a lot of things are in our procedural memories which become automatic. So the process of automaticity happens in this backwards and forwards movement between long-term memory, short-term memories, and response output. So there are various different kinds of memories that are stored, and in order to retrieve the storage from long-term memory, it goes back into our temporary working space so that we can then have a response and an output, so that we can then do writing or reading or speaking. There can be some response, some output that happens there. Okay, so that's a brief overview of how the information processing model works, and you can go and read up on it and get more detail. What happens along the way when we are dealing with learning problems and learning disabilities is that there is there's one more slide. So let's just quickly look at this. This is also the information processing model. Again, sensory input comes in, goes into working memory, into long-term memory, and this model adds the response generator to the output, and it also adds this amazing processing that happens in the human brain at the cortical level, where we have executive control, and this is what our prefrontal cortex does. It's the brain part that sits right in the front of your head, and at this place you are controlling, you're thinking about things, all the metacognitive functioning, planning, making decisions, all takes place in that executive control space. So the model can get quite complex, and learners with learning problems can have difficulties at all of these stages. But what happens with learning problems is that at any stage there's a difficulty, and there is continual interference and inaccuracies that happen. So we can have problems at all stages of this input-output processing model. There can be difficulties with the information that comes into the sensory memory, into the sensory register. There can, and at the sensory register itself, where we are recording or looking at stuff, there can be decay. So instead of seeing things clearly, we don't see them, and there are lots of experiments that tell us that we are very bad as human beings at taking the information in that is presented to us in our environments at all times, because we would get sensory overload, and so we filter out a lot of the things. So we really focus and we see what we want to see, we hear what we want to see, we sense what we want to see, and other things don't make it into the short-term memory and the long-term memory. What also happens when information gets in, there can be problems with attending to what we need to attend to, and things don't get into short-term memory to be rehearsed and to be encoded into long-term memory. And we have a lot of what's called loss, where information is not processed accurately, it's inaccurately processed. And once information does get into long-term memory, which is what we're doing as teachers all the time, trying to get learners to store information correctly and accurately and in the right procedures and orders and so on in their long-term memories. There is forgetting that happens in long-term memory. Our memories are not like computers that will store something permanently and keep it there all the time. Forgetting happens. We lose the cues to help us retrieve that information out of long-term memory. And so when we ask people to remember these things, they have difficulty retrieving the information, bringing it back into conscious focus in the short-term memory, and putting that information as an output in speaking or writing or doing something. So when we're talking about learning problems and learning difficulties, we must bear in mind that the underlying information processing that is happening in the child's brain is problematic. So there are things that can happen at all stages of the input-output processing model. And we think about these a lot as filters as well. And our information that comes in through our senses from external environments goes into, as I say, the sensory register and then the short-term working memory. But we have these filters that are constantly interfering and distorting all the information. The filters make us generalize things. We take our emotions, the emotional state that we're in currently, and that filters the way that we process information. So you all know when you're feeling upset, when a child is going through some kind of trauma at home, that they are not able to focus on the academic classwork. You know when you have physiological difficulties, if you're hungry or if you're tired, or if a person is ill, these physiological problems are also interfering and distorting the information that is learned. So we are constantly being subject to our own emotions, our previous experiences, our previous memories, our attitudes and our values as well of things that we understand and our belief systems. All of these things are having an influence on how we perceive and process and store information. We decide what we're going to attend to. We decide whether the information is valid or not valid. We decide whether what the teacher's teaching us is useful information for us, or if we don't think it's going to be useful, we don't attend to it. So learners are constantly in our human brains are constantly in these complex processes of deciding how learning is going to take place. So So learning is a very complex process. There's the basic understanding of input from our senses. It gets processed, stored in long-term memory, retrieved, and then there's output. But the filters that distort, interfere, and have an influence on how we function and how on what information we store is having a huge impact for learners every day, all day. And I think sometimes as teachers, we forget that we are dealing with human brains. And on top of all of this normal learning processing that takes place, as educators, we are dealing with developing brains, children whose brains are in the process of being formed. So they are developing neural connections, the myelination sheaths around the neurons are being processed. Pruning takes place. There are a variety of different processes in the brain that are taking place while it is developing. So not only as teachers are we dealing with all of the filters and interference, we are also dealing with immature brains that are in process of being developed and are all at different stages of brain development. So I want to focus very much now on this idea of specific learning disabilities. I think you now have an understanding of where it comes from, the underlying foundational physiological problems. But let's just look now at some of the criteria and some of the characteristics of SLD. So in order to say that a learner has an SLD, we have to look at their age, their ability levels, and then we look at the specific areas of difficulty that the person is experiencing. So to say that a child has SLD, they are not achieving at the proper or appropriate age and ability levels in one or more of several specific areas. This is despite having been provided with appropriate learning experiences and age-appropriate instruction in these areas. So the child has had adequate schooling. They have had exposure to books and to doing maths. They've had educators. They've been taught. It's not like a child who has had neglect or has been in an environment where they have not been exposed to the learning material. So despite adequate learning experiences and appropriate instruction, they are still having difficulty with oral language, with listening, with writing, with reading, reading accurately, reading fluently, with reading comprehension, with mathematical calculations and mathematical problem solving. So these are the what we call the specifics, the specific areas where the disability, the organic disability in the brain is manifesting as problems that the child is having. So the child is not making adequate progress and not meeting age or grade level standards in these areas. So we're seeing a pattern. We know that everybody has difficulties with some of these things at some time. And a lot of people have difficulties with, for instance, maths. But we are talking here about chronic, long-term, not just, oh, I can't do maths attitude, but children who really have tried their best and have a real difficulty doing these things. So there's a long-term pattern, and it is having severe impact on the child's performance, and they are definitely not able to develop to meet the criteria that other children at that age are meeting. So they're not meeting grade level standards. We have to rule out intellectual disabilities and intellectual difficulties. A child with an SLD has an average IQ. They are not intellectually disabled. A child who's intellectually disabled has difficulties meeting all their milestones. They have difficulties learning to speak, and we're going to do a lecture on intellectual ID so that you get an idea of that later. But for SLD, everything about the child looks normal. So when you speak to them, when they come into school, they look like they're going to cope. The expectation is that they should be able to do things. They should be able to learn to read and write and do the maths and the language that other children are doing. However, they don't perform. They just don't. They're not able to do this. And in order to make a proper diagnosis of SLD, a proper certified health professional has to make that diagnosis. So as teachers, as remedial therapists, as learning support educators, you may not make the diagnosis of SLD. You certainly will be seeing these learners, and you will be able to identify them and do screening, which is what all the scholastic assessments are about. You will be able to identify and screen, but the actual hanging of the label around the child, making that diagnosis in a formal report, has to happen by a mental health professional. So this can only happen by a person who is registered with the Health Professions Council, either an educational psychologist, a counseling psychologist, I'm not even sure that medical doctors can make the diagnosis, but I think a psychiatrist can. So a medical doctor who's got psychiatric training can make such a diagnosis. Therefore, it's important for us as educators to have networks of people that we network with. So we need to have names of educational psychologists, counseling psychologists that are working in our areas who can do the proper assessments to make that diagnostic call. In your assignments for your scholastic assessment module, when you write your reports for scholastic assessment, you can say that you suspect or you think that the child is showing signs of a learning disability. They're showing signs of severe learning problems, but you may not say the child has a specific learning disability. So you can't make that actual diagnosis step. That is done in conjunction with a professional. Because this is a really severe diagnosis that is being made, you are actually, the diagnostics are in the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and the diagnosis sits in the manual that doctors use at the World Health Organization. So the ICD-10 codes, the International Disease Codes, medical professions have to use specific codes to make these diagnoses, and so it becomes an underlying medical condition. And it's important for us as learning support educators to know this, that you work closely with people who make the proper diagnosis. Okay. I'm going to just go on to the next slide. And then I think I'm going to open up for questions, and we'll do the following slides after that. I might just record them later for you. But I'll put all the slides up on Blackboard. So the characteristics of a specific learning disorder. We're seeing problems with academics, as I've mentioned. The disorders of all the attention ADD stuff can come in as well, but that ADHD is a specific, has its own diagnosis. We often see children with poor motor abilities, poor planning abilities, because this is problems with the output. There are psychological processes or deficits in their information processing. There's problems with cognitive strategies that are not efficient, and that we know is happening at the executive functioning level. Difficulties with oral language, and this has got to do with output difficulties. Difficulties with reading, we know difficulties with writing, difficulties with organizing the writing, sometimes problems with handwriting, all sorts of difficulties around mathematics and social skills deficits. So I want to read a little story for you about a learner to give you some idea of how these specific learning disabilities manifest in the classroom and what they do. So Noah felt like he was always doing schoolwork. While his friends were meeting for soccer games after school, he was back at home in his room reading and rereading the same material. But no matter how hard Noah studied, he had difficulty remembering things, and his grades always stayed average. Meanwhile, his friend Sean, who never seemed to study, always did well in all his tests. It didn't seem fair. So can you see that the child with learning problems is in the same grade as children with, and the same school as children who don't have learning problems, but he is not understanding things. He is not being able to encode what he reads into long-term memory, and he's not able to then have the output that goes with it when he has to retrieve that information and put it into a test or a worksheet or so on. So what happens with these children is that they start knowing that they can't do these things. Their self-esteem drops. Because Noah was so frustrated, his dad made an appointment with the school psychologist, and she diagnosed Noah with a learning disability. Although he felt relieved to know what was going on, and this is often a relief for parents and children to know that they, although there might be some difficulty with them, they kind of feel relieved because I kind of now know why I'm not able to cope and not able to do all the things that other children can do. However, it still comes with difficulties that just because you know what the label is does not make the problem go away. Noah was still worried. He didn't like this disability label, and that's why we have to be very careful when we use these labels. And there's a whole series of debates that we can have about using labels of disability and ability. Noah was concerned about what it might mean for his future, and so are parents. Parents are very worried about what this means, and that's why it's key for us that you include the parents in your diagnosis. Would he be able to go to college and study engineering as he had hoped? And often these children, because they're having difficulty with maths and with all the reading that's included, they have difficulty actually getting an adequate matric so that they can get into high level things like engineering and so on. But for someone diagnosed with a learning disability, it can seem scary at first. But a learning disability doesn't have anything to do with the person's intelligence. So remember I said that their IQ and intelligence is at a normal level. It's at an average level. But after all, many successful people, such as Walt Disney, Alexander Graham Bell, who invented a whole lot of things, including the telephone, and Winston Churchill, a very successful president of England, all had learning disabilities. Noah is one of nearly 4 million, or probably more, school-age children and teenagers who are diagnosed with learning disabilities. So these children are not alone. We know, as educators, as people, we know a lot about this disability, and we also know a lot about how to help and support these children. So I'm going to stop the recording there because I think I've given you a lot of information about SLD.